As it came around the side of the truck, it looked me right in the eye. I was pretty much paralyzed with fear and shock and awe. I went to jump in the truck, and when I turned, there was about an 8.5-foot one standing behind the truck.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Film Seizure Streams the Movies. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of Film Seizure and host of Monster Mondays. I'm here with a review of the new film from Seth Breedlove and his Small Town Monsters production company. And this is called On the Trail of Bigfoot, The Journey. Now this is part of Small Town Monsters On the Trail series. This is not the only one to feature Bigfoot, and there's actually another one coming in about 6 months or so. This is the third of the Breedlove produced small town monster films that I have watched. I'm a huge fan of what he does because it really kind of goes beyond what some people would maybe, deem cuckoo or overly fantastic, in the sense that you come to truly believe these kind of creatures exist. It's not that at all, really. Honestly, I love the idea of cryptids, cryptozoology, trying to find mythical creatures and so forth. I love monsters. Hell, I host a show called Monster Mondays that celebrates monster movies. But to say that I'm truly a believer in these kind of mythical or bizarre or monstrous or simply hardly seen creatures, that wouldn't necessarily be accurate. As I said, I do love the idea of these things. I love the concept that something beyond our comfortable and so-called civilized existence could essentially be lurking out there and really pretty good at hiding itself. And I love that idea, the idea of the various cryptid creatures, aliens, ghosts. The concept itself is something that I very, very much support. But I am a little bit more on the skeptical side of things, and it's why I can really get invested in these types of documentaries about these things. It's because I do like those ideas. I think I said in one of the past times that I watched one of the Small Town Monsters movies that there's nothing better than watching ghost hunting shows in October. It's all kind of part of that sort of stuff that you just want to do, that you want to hear the stories about, even if you're a little skeptical. Now, but what I do find a lot more interesting, and I've said this also in a previous review for Small Town Monsters features, is the folklore element. These are a kind of fundamental part of our collective story as a species. Every single corner of this world has some sort of a story about creatures and monsters born really straight out of myth or superstition. And that's what's incredibly interesting to me. This folklore has heavy, heavy effects on the people who live this stuff. For those who believe they've seen something, or they just want people to hear their amazing story and not think that they are crazy. And those people who basically come into this area, live here, or the area where, it really kind of attracts seekers and gawkers. These people want to be taken seriously. They experience something that they can't really explain. Some people will make the next logical leap into the faith side of things and think that what their brains could put together is what they saw. Meanwhile, there are a lot of people who just simply want answers, or they just want to know what it is that they saw. So the two previous films that Breedlove produced that I reviewed looked at this from both sides of that folklore interest that I have. With the Mothman Legacy that I watched the last time, we do hear how a town both processes tragedy and also survive by idolizing this strange creature that began appearing just before the tragedy. But on the opposite side of that, the first film of his that I reviewed was Momo, the Missouri Monster. And in that, we got the story of an area that really just kind of wants to distance itself from this legacy. It's a direct opposite, because people in this area of Missouri are not really believers. They really do not wish to profit from the stories told about the Missouri Monster. And really, they just kind of want to be left alone. And it's this direct opposite reaction and situation that makes this type of folklore so appealing to me. Point Pleasant, West Virginia is thriving. Meanwhile, Louisiana, Missouri is a town that either wants to be left alone and remain quiet, or it's okay with the concept that the aging town is quite possibly slowly dying. Whatever the situation is there, that town really just kind of wants to do it quietly. Okay. Now it's time to take a look at one of the heavy hitters of the cryptid world, Bigfoot. Bigfoot, or the Sasquatch, as it is also called, is a myth that spans the entirety of the United States and Canada. It is probably the most sought out and famous of the cryptids. This is true kind of S-level type of stuff here. It probably is the alpha of the cryptids. I mean, even superseding the Mothman and the Loch Ness Monster. But because Bigfoot has so many adoring fans, I have to say that actually it's the one creature that I probably have the least amount of actual affection for. And it's not that I dislike Bigfoot. It's just that, he has enough fans all over North America. He doesn't really need me to stand for him, So not to mention that some of the Bigfoot hunter shows that have cropped up over the last 10 to 15 years are really kind of silly in a lot of ways. But here, in Breedlove I trust as a filmmaker, and I know he's going to get the stories from the people who truly believe that they saw something strange, or the local experts who have made this kind of this passion a lifetime of searching for the elusive creature, or like Emily Fleur, who is a youngster in the field of cryptozoology who just wants to know what the world has to offer in her own backyard. So, this movie really already kind of is going to appeal to me on several levels, especially with that folklore and the local interest side of things. But right out of the gate, this movie actually instantly has a completely different feel in it. There's a personal level to this documentary that interweaves into the primary story about Bigfoot in the New England area. And I'll get to that here in a little bit. But we begin basically 1 year ago. It's June 2020. Seth Breedlove, like all of us, was on lockdown and contemplating when things can really kind of be normal again with COVID-19. And normal for him is to get out into the world and try to find monsters or hear other stories about the monsters. So he decides to take this opportunity to revisit an area of New York State that he visited some years ago doing another documentary. And he heads out with some fellow seekers and head into the sprawling eastern and northern bits of New York in the Adirondack Mountains. Now, I often find little things in these documentaries that stand out to me. In this, we get a quick history lesson as well as a general lesson on how to research Bigfoot sightings. For example, there was conversation in there about, it's kind of hard to Google things like Bigfoot sightings in New York or any other place. It's not that you can't find information, it's that sometimes you don't find quite the same credible reports that way. I did this for myself. I went out and, Googled Bigfoot sightings in the Adirondacks or in New York State or something like that. And a lot of what came up were either personal blogs, which are going to be in some situations like Emily Fleur that I mentioned earlier. She has kind of her own little website and her own little group on Facebook and everything that is that's really kind of there to kind of start her journey in the investigation side of things. However, a lot of other things that I found were more about like the celebrations in the small towns around the Adirondacks that were kind of sticking out more than the informational type of stuff. So, the idea was that particularly in the older days when you're trying to find information about this, particularly in newspapers and such, you usually had to search for things like creature sightings in whatever area that you're looking for. And that's what ultimately sold in the newspapers. So it seemed like the small town papers really kind of the one to sell the newspapers with compelling stories, but they didn't really want to out and out call something Bigfoot or Sasquatch. That was probably not something that would have given the small towns in the areas that much credibility. In fact, you probably would have had a lot of people from New York or even Albany and Boston would probably look at that as, oh, it's just some hicks, talking about Bigfoot. It wouldn't really help their credibility necessarily. There was also a story told in this about a guy wanting to run for a public office and thought that if he found this fabled mountain man, as they originally called it, in the Adirondacks, and if he drug him out of the Adirondacks, he would easily win the election. He tried, he failed, he lost the election. And it's those types of little stories that are interesting and funny. It's something that you might get lucky to hear on various other shows or documentaries, but I do kind of feel like that Breedlove does a really great job vetting the people that he talks to with actual historical context and knowledge. And for this documentary, he finds some of the very top experts in this area of New York, people who spent literally 40 years researching the topic and never really giving up, even though they never really found anything either, or at least they never snapped a picture of Bigfoot. It's really interesting because the vastness of the Adirondack area and the fact that it is one of the few protected places where you can have towns there, you can have you can have the roads that go into it, but really, for the most part, nothing can be done to that area anymore. You can't harvest the wood from the trees out there. So, there's this 6 million acre just spot in the Northeast United States that goes from northern New York to Vermont, down to western Massachusetts. And there's a lot of untouched stuff in there. And when people go in there and they hike and they see that deer seem unnaturally killed, people kind of wonder a little bit about what might have bent that deer in half, for example. And there are stories like that really kind of start to charge that imagination. And it goes a little bit further than that. But most of the documentary features Breedlove and his crew literally camping and investigating the area. And again, Breedlove has investigators ranging from people with an interest to true tracking abilities, and even local authorities who get the reports and head out to take a look at what's been stated by the witnesses. And I tend to still fall on the skeptical side, but I appreciate that the investigators and Breedlove's crew are careful in how they speak about what they are seeking. The word "if" is used a lot in this because it really kind of needs to be. You listen to the stories, you take the people for their word and don't assume that they're nutters, and you then investigate that. Of course, if you have an interest in something like this, you want to believe and you want to find these things. But you're not being forced into taking a particular side on the subject, either as a viewer or as a participant in this. And if you have a belief in the concept that Bigfoot is real, there's evidence presented to back that belief in this. If you don't believe it exists, well, there's kind of, there's evidence presented that supports that side too, or at least maybe a lack of evidence, if you will, outside of firsthand accounts and possibly even secondhand accounts. But and there's at least enough to not feel like you're being sold a load of BS. And that's really kind of important about these types of movies, because that's where that folklore and the way people want to interact with nature really kind of starts to bubble up in the story. So if you are in the middle, you get to really see a lot of both sides of the discussion, mixing the history, the science around migration, the climate, food sources, and so on. And the investigation gives something for literally everyone. Now, we get that good folklore that keeps me wanting to see more from Breedlove as well. He returns to Whitehall, where he made a documentary about a creature encounter on a Bear Road. A book was written in the 80s that really highlighted that incident, and it created basically a capital of Eastern Seaboard cryptozoology. Whitehall, New York embraces the story and the sightings, and it's now part of the culture of the small town tucked away, really literally at the foot of the Adirondacks. Then, a little bit down the road in the connecting areas and following what they call the green trail of similar topography, the movie visits Kinderhook. And that place also feels very eerie. It's a town that has had their sightings, and those stories of those sightings have kind of imprinted onto the town's identity. And it's they even mentioned that it's almost like a town that you would see in a movie, with its secrets. And it's, like if something creepy were to happen here, it looks like a place where something creepy could happen here. And it's really interesting because it's almost like the town wants it to be that way. It's willing itself to be that. Now, the team also head into Massachusetts in the final third of the movie and look in the Appalachian area of Western Mass. Lots of reports came out of that area, and it would make some sense on the migration path that a Bigfoot, if Bigfoot exists, would come down into the area out of the Adirondacks, particularly when it's kind of migrating either during the winter or looking for food sources. Whatever the case may be, the migration kind of makes sense. Their guide that they have for that area takes them into the area almost like a tourist type of adventure. He even talks about how things are going to get thrown at them and that he likes that and all of that. And that was the one guy, as far as the investigators that they talked to, that I really kind of found funnier than the other investigators. He really kind of wants to give them a show, and he almost kind of leans into it. Now, I don't think that he's necessarily a huckster, but there is a little bit of showmanship that he kind of puts into it that I found really kind of funny, because you can almost see Breedlove's crew almost think it's like, oh, is this guy for real or not? But it turns out to be somewhat fruitful. That investigation and that trip, that was one of those kind of interesting moments that happened. However, there is one more thing that's important in this movie, and that's the personal side of the journey, which is the subtitle of this whole documentary. This feels extremely personal for Breedlove. He mentions in the movie about the love of the stories that he hears and of all the places that he's ever been in his monster hunting career. The Adirondacks is the only place that really makes him feel almost certain that Bigfoot could biologically exist, and isn't just a story or a hope that something exists beyond the stories. Breedlove truly is deeply in love with this area of the country. And this seems to only be greater because of the kind of crappy scenario we were all in since the start of the pandemic. He feels almost at home and finds clarity in the area as he kind of reconnects with this almost untouched patch of the United States that's really getting harder to find nowadays. And there's a lot of comparison drawn to the Pacific Northwest. That's also where you see a lot of Bigfoot sightings, and it's also this very large wooded area that has the same type of kind of concept, where it's like when we see Bigfoot start to get sighted in British Columbia, then a little bit later in the year it's down into Washington, a little bit later it's into Oregon, and then into Northern California. It follows a lot of the same things that you hear in the sightings in this part of the Northeast, and they compare that a lot, and it really kind of seems as though that Breedlove has this really, really special connection to the Northeast of the United States, and this really kind of almost mystical thing that the Adirondacks kind of bring with it. It's this very it's such a large area that very few people go into. There are almost no towns within the region. They kind of dot the outside of it, or the very, very just inside the border of the Adirondacks. But it's just this area that it would seem as though if there is something hiding in there, then there's enough places for it to hide, and it really kind of creates this almost eerie but also magical kind of feeling, and you can really kind of hear that and see that in Breedlove and how he talks about the area as he talks about the investigation and so forth. And then on top of all of that, there's a camaraderie in these stories that are being shared. At the end, Breedlove reflects on what the experience gave him. He met some interesting people, heard some really good stories, and directly experienced something kind of strange. But in the end, there's a revelation that there's wonder to the world that connects us to nature and helps us really kind of find a way to still find the new mysteries of life. So really, in conclusion, On the Trail of Bigfoot, the journey is just as much a love letter to the unmolested vastness of the Adirondacks as it is a search for a fantastical creature. And I really do strongly recommend this for people interested in cryptozoology and honest information surrounding the stories and the effect that it has on the local small towns that these sightings always seem to kind of happen around. It really is made with a lot of love and true appreciation for what makes our world strange and wonderful, both in the sense that if there is a creature like Bigfoot out there, that's amazing. And I do see a lot of people make comments, like particularly like in the comment section of the YouTube trailer for this. A lot of people do say things like, well, with the number of people that have claimed to see him, it almost seems unlikely that Bigfoot doesn't exist. And I don't know about that. I really don't. Again, I kind of stay, I think, healthily skeptical. I don't want to just say he doesn't exist. But think about it. Like, there is a wonder to the idea of something like that existing. Breedlove says it himself, that the Adirondacks makes him feel like that if something like that could exist, it would be here. But also, again, that unmolested space in the United States in an area that is really technically densely populated around it. It creates that secondary wonder of, do we really need the fantastical creature to see how beautiful this world is and this part of the country is? So it doesn't really kind of follow that same it doesn't follow that same appreciation for the folklore elements that the previous two that I've seen from Breedlove, but it does something different, and it makes it a lot more personal, and I really, really appreciate that. And I think that this really kind of shows a lot of that as well. But Small Town Monsters On the Trail of Bigfoot, The Journey is available for pre-order right now. It will be available for purchase and streaming on June 7th. You can go to smalltownmonsters.com to see what other films they have coming out on the horizon, as well as take a trip through their shop for physical media, t-shirts, soundtracks, prints, and other goodies. As for Film Seizure and all of our goodies, you can go to www.filmseizure.com to find everything we do there. You can follow the site directly from there, or you can go to your favorite podcast vendor like SoundCloud, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Audible, and TuneIn, and subscribe at any of those places as well. We even upload our stuff onto YouTube as well, so why not subscribe to all the places? You can also follow us on social media by searching for Film Seizure on Facebook, Twitter, and even on Instagram. And don't forget that every Wednesday is a new episode of Film Seizure, the regular home-based podcast. Each Monday brings a new episode of Monster Mondays. We're oh so very close to more Film Seizure at the movies as the world begins to kind of pivot away from the pandemic and back to more normal things like theaters and such. I can say for absolute certainty that we'll be doing more and more of these as new movie releases, both from theaters or streaming services start to kind of release. Now, finally, you can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, and see brand new articles every Friday morning. Follow that site on Facebook and Twitter as well. Also, check out the B Movie Anima channel on YouTube because I'm hard at work on season number 2 of the movie hosting version of B Movie Anima, the series, which will return this September. So, that should just about do it for this edition of Film Seizure Streams the Movies. I'm Geoff Arbuckle. Watch out for random Bigfoot attacks and be sure to leave me a spot at the end of the couch.
One thing that's impressed me in the 40 years is how this topic can be a life changer.